Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for being here, and welcome to 100 Years of Preservation. Don't do the math, this is going to be a little rough. Basically, we're looking back and looking forward. My name is Karen Loew. I'm the Director of East Village and Special Projects for the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. And it was 50 years ago last week, April 19th, 1965, that Mayor Robert Wagner signed New York City's Landmarks Law. And our special guest tonight, Anthony Wood, is an expert on all that led up to that moment, as well as everything that came after. But all that led up to it, many decades of cultural loss and a vast effort by concerned people. So we are going to look back to before 1965 to discuss some of the history of the preservation movement itself that Tony insists we must learn from. And we are going to review some of the high and low points that have occurred since then. And we are going to look at how preservation in New York City can best evolve in the years to come. And I have a feeling that past, present, and future are all going to merge, so fair warning. And we'll also have plenty of time at the end for questions, so make them good. If I were to tell you all of Anthony Wood's preservation credentials, we would be here all night. So here are a few relevant notes. Tony is the founder of the New York Preservation Archive Project, which is a repository for our movement's history and a catalyst for us to recognize and value that history. He authored a book published by Routledge in 2008 called Preserving New York, Winning the Right to Protect a City's Landmarks, which I commend to you strongly. I would call it a landmark work. Deeply researched, beautifully illustrated, and very well written, and we will draw on that story tonight. Tony studied history at Kenyon College and earned a master's degree in urban planning at the University of Illinois. He has in the past worked at the Landmarks Preservation Commission, at the Municipal Art Society, and at the J.M. Kaplan Fund, and presently directs the Carlson Foundation. And he sits on more preservation and other boards than we could possibly name right now. So he's a busy man, and we're delighted to be hearing from him tonight. I'm going to start out by asking Tony, why is it so important for us working in preservation today to know the past of this movement? Why does it matter?
That could take the rest of this program. But the key points for me are that the history of preservation is actually the greatest repository, kind of intellectual capital for the preservation movement, in terms of, in a sense, the whole notion of working on the shoulder of giants. So we look at the battles that have happened, what we've learned from them. So to me, it's a key way of being grounded. Also, I talk to a lot of preservation activists, and kind of the first thing out of their mouth is, boy, no one's done this before. How do you do it? And the response is, no. The good news is lots of people have been able to do some of this before, and you can learn from it, and you're part of a great tradition of advocacy. There's also a political reason why the history is so important. Sadly, an eminent historian, Ken Jackson, who otherwise is wonderful, has this really blind spot when it comes to historic preservation. He maintains that the essence of New York is all about change. Anything that isn't about change is not about New York, and therefore he's basically hostile to historic preservation. So his narrative suggests preservation came to the party rather late. And actually, that's why, knowing our history, that people have been fighting to manage change in New York for well over 100 years. So we didn't come late to the party. And so I think it's also politically to remember that preservation is not an outlier in terms of what makes New York New York. It's part of a vibrant debate that's been going on for over a century.
And do you feel that, certainly I am greatly enriched by reading your book and get why it's important for us to know the history. I'm just curious, do you think is it different than in any other movement for people who are working for civil rights to know something about the history of the civil rights movement, or is it true for all movements?
I think for all movements. I mean, Chris, you're talking to somebody who had an undergrad degree in history, so I drank the Kool-Aid early on the importance of history. But yeah, I don't think we're unique in not paying enough attention to our history. I mean, particularly advocacy movements. The preservation movement, when it comes to its history, is kind of like the old story about the shoemaker's kids go barefoot. I mean, preservationists have been out there for decades saving other people's history, which is what the buildings represent and the culture that they represent. And I think they just haven't kind of stepped back to say, oh wait, we've got a history, and it will be as valuable to us as the history we've been saving for the larger narrative.
Now, we're going to try to cover a little bit of of what led up to the signing of the Landmarks Law in 1965, and there's a lot to say. So we'll try to hone in. There was a wonderful man named Albert Bard, who died, I believe, at the age of 97 in 1963. Born in 1866, a lawyer and civic activist who did an awful lot to get us here today. Tony has done great things to preserve his memory and to honor his accomplishments. And I guess the biggest thing for us today is that he worked very hard to get a state level piece of legislation passed, which was called the Bard Act. I guess we'd call it enabling legislation that allowed a city landmarks law to be passed. And if you can, maybe you can tell us about him and his long struggle, a bit about what led up to that important state law being passed.
Well, Bard was a true visionary. He was also, I think, just by nature, a stubborn individual. He was really like a dog with a bone when it came to a firm belief he had that cities, society, ought to be able to regulate private property on aesthetic grounds. That was as important to society and a city as the police power to otherwise protect things of greater value. And so he had this idea and articulated in 1913. The Supreme Court got around to Bard's thinking in 1954. But Bard kind of put this notion, not uniquely, but he was the one in the New York narrative who kind of put that forward in 1913, suggested we needed a state constitutional amendment to put that in place. And he advocated that in 1913. He brought it out again in 1938. New York would revisit the notion of a constitutional amendment every 20 years. And Bard would just keep pulling it out of his files and keep advocating it. And one of the great things about Bard and the history, and why history is important, is big transformative ideas take time. If Bard had been disappointed when it failed in 1913 and left the game, instead, he stuck with it for decade after decade. And I think that's one of the important lessons. And I know some of the people in this room have been involved in, say, getting a historic district designated. That can take, hopefully not 40 years, but takes time. So this is about being in it for the long haul. And I think some of the narrative around Bard and his accomplishments helps lift that point out. And also, I mean, if you were doing the pantheon of preservation gods, one of them would have to be Albert Bard. But I can go long on Bard.
Yeah. Well, you've been his great champion. Now, so 1913 you mentioned, but that was when he...
This idea was put forward in a report. What actually triggered it, and I guess this may be in the category of death and taxes are always with us, and same as advertising and too much advertising and signage. So in 1913 there was a large problem in New York of signs that were kind of taking over and beginning to destroy Fifth Avenue, and the Fifth Avenue Business Association, or some version of that title, was very upset about this and got the mayor to appoint a commission to study how can you regulate signage in New York. And Bard was part of that. The Municipal Art Society supported that. The Ash Heaps, the American Senior Historic Preservation Society, supported that effort. And they basically concluded in this report, we can't do anything unless we have legal authority to do it. We need enabling legislation in Albany to do it. And so that was kind of the framework at that moment, and then it evolved.
Right, yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that, because I was going to say, in 1912, the Commission to Study Billboards was created, and I kind of got a kick out of reading about that in your book. As a billboard fighter myself, I lived on the edge of the sort of where the Meatpacking District and the West Village and Chelsea come together, West 14th Street, at about the millennium. And when billboards were going up in the Meatpacking District, and they were illegal, and maybe are, but somehow they're still there. And
well, you could have joined. Bard was big nationally fighting billboards and worked with a wonderful group of ladies who are called the Scenic Sisters. So you could be one of the new generation Scenic Sisters.
Absolutely. And the billboards then were perhaps worse than now. They were everywhere.
They were perhaps more disturbing and
Yeah,
shocking
and they were
from a societal point of view. I mean,
Yeah.
today it's kind of like...
Yeah, maybe we're a bit used to it. But speaking of what was it, the Scenic Ladies?
Scenic Sisters.
Yes, there were so many groups before, in the years before the law, and now of course there are a lot of groups, but something you talk about is the intellectual capital that was created, and the two streams of intellectual capital. Can you talk about that? Because this would...
Sure. I mean, my take on the history, and there are others and experts in the audience who may want to join us when it comes to Q&A on this, but my take is that there were really two intellectual streams that ultimately came together in the landmarks law. And one of them was the City Beautiful movement. And if you look back at the turn of the century, so many New Yorkers went to Chicago to see the great world, the White City in Chicago. And there on the shores of the lake was a city of beauty that had really not ever been seen in America. For years, architects have been going to Europe to see what beautiful cities were like. Yet here, on the shores, of that lake was this glistening white city. And New Yorkers came back and said, why can't we do that on the Hudson? And so out of that experience and kind of the larger kind of issues it catalyzed, a number of groups were created. Municipal Art Society, a number of art societies who were motivated from an aesthetic motivation of a city beautiful, of making a city beautiful. So that was kind of one stream that led into the landmarks motivation. And then the other was kind of more the patriotic, the concern with protecting historic sites driven by a concern for history and patriotism. Part of it triggered by the great immigrations that were going on, and a belief that if immigrants could experience the buildings and touch the places touched by the great founding fathers, they would become Americans. But it was very much about a patriotic tradition. And so those were kind of the associated sites, saving the sites associated with great Americans and great events in American history. So those were kind of the two streams. And they were not, diametrically opposed at all to each other, and there were people who were kind of equally engaged in both. But those were the two that ultimately came together in the law, and kind of, I think, ironically in one sense, the aesthetic drive is what then drove the law the most in its early years. So our landmarks law allows the commission to designate buildings that are of historical importance, architectural importance, and cultural importance. The vast majority of resources protected in New York have been on architectural grounds. Partially because it was kind of easier to articulate why a building was important. I think secondly, it was the dominance of this kind of aesthetic motivation. So groups like the Municipal Art Society, the Society of Architectural Historians, were very involved in driving the law. And of course, the law, the commission was populated by architectural historians. So I think that's one reason why the history also helps explain how the law began to unfold operationally as the commission started to designate buildings in 1965.
Let's see, there are a lot of directions we could go from there. So something that this builds to is well, I want to talk about Robert Moses and Penn Station. Let's talk about Robert Moses as a character who also was incredibly a catalyst for the preservation movement. And I bet a lot of people, some people here might not know the story of Castle Clinton in particular, but Robert Moses, shaped the city in so many ways, but he provided a person to organize in opposition to, right?
Robert Moses is the gift that keeps giving when it comes to the history of preservation. He, as you probably most of you know, and hopefully you've all read The Power Broker by Robert Caro, and if you haven't, just get up now, leave, go to a bookstore and buy it, because it is still one of the most instructive books. But I mean, Caro was, very involved in civic affairs. Moses was very involved, and at a certain moment, kind of, I like to say, went to the dark side of the force. I mean, he was a reformer initially, and then he kind of moved into the type of mindset in government of really driving projects, his vision over any other vision, and basically became a steamroller. And it took really decades for the civic community to wake up to really how extreme Moses was willing to be to accomplish his vision for New York. And he was driven by a vision. I mean, he was not somebody who was doing what he was doing to enrich himself in any way. He had a vision, a driving vision for what he thought the city should be like. And so much of it involved the automobile and making the city making the city accommodate the automobile. But Moses basically became so focused and so powerful also that he was basically able to leave tire marks on everybody's face and ran over the few processes that were in place. So the reason we owe so much to Robert Moses was his extreme in the 50s really took a group of well-behaved civic leaders who normally would write letters and gently complain and turned them into a really organized, passionate group of defenders who, having seen what Moses could do in an unleashed way, were just so incensed, personally offended by it, just realizing the extreme, that uncontrolled power, what it could do to the city. And so he energized a whole generation of civic leaders who then became preservationists. And many of them didn't believe that Moses was as bad as others had said until they confronted him directly and saw the lies and saw the manipulation and the power and the raw execution of power.
And so in talking about, to take just a few episodes, fighting against Billboards, fighting against Robert Moses, Albert Bard's getting the Bard Act passed as enabling legislation. These are just a few episodes, but you can see that this idea that the destruction of Penn Station, gave birth to the preservation movement, if anyone still has that notion, just isn't true. And that by the time that Penn Station began to be demolished in '63, or 62?
No, but
it took 3 years.
Protests, August '62, demolition began October '63.
And it took 3 years.
3 long years.
And that was a very important moment, but you can see that things were gathering in very important ways for a long time. Do you want to say anything else about Penn Station and our understanding of it today?
Well, I don't in any way want to undermine the important role of Penn Station in the narrative, but the danger of kind of the shorthand that has been used over and over, that it's all about Penn Station, reinforces this notion that it's a great morality tale. New York tears down this wonderful building, and out of its ashes come the Landmarks Law, and it's kind of a morality tale. We redeemed ourselves. But the danger of that is it really ignores these decades and decades of serious work that laid the groundwork for the preservation movement. And it falls into the Ken Jackson myth that preservation is kind of new on the scene in New York and really doesn't have any roots. It's not part of the DNA of the city. So Penn Station nationally, you probably, if you're preservationists, have visited another city, and if you're talking to like-minded people, somebody will say, well, that was our Penn Station. When we lost that building, we woke up. When we lost the city hall, when we lost the courthouse. And so kind of it's become a real shorthand in terms of people's understanding of advocacy around preservation.
And I think you used the term to say that the Landmarks Law, when it was in fact passed in New York City, when it was signed into law in 1965, kind of created the playing field that we play on now. It enabled the designation of city landmarks, the protection of city landmarks, the creation of historic districts that would be protected, and so then things changed. Then the lists that preservationists had created of buildings to be saved could be acted on, and despite or because of the fact of the law, the fights have lustily continued. Not every place that we wanted to be saved was saved, and Tony's career has overlapped with a lot of that, and you've seen how advocacy has changed, the approach over the decades, once you had a law. And tell us about that evolution.
Well, it's interesting, a lot has changed and a lot hasn't changed. If you go back and look at the advocacy campaign that was launched battling Moses to save Castle Clinton, it has so many of the elements of kind of a standard preservation campaign that we would have had in the 1980s or 1990s. Putting a coalition together, using basically every opportunity where a project needed, permission to be there, to let no stone unturned, prepare for legal action, public education, awareness, publicity. Kind of all the things that GVSHP does so well. You can find their roots certainly all the way back to the Battle of Castle Clinton. I think the interesting challenge today is looking at how the context of any advocacy has changed, even in the last 15, 20 years. So many years ago, I worked at the Municipal Art Society in the 80s, and what was interesting was at that point, some of their successful advocacy was the ability to pick up a phone and call a deputy mayor who was, had a relationship with the civic community, and actually have an offline conversation to explain why a policy needed, should go forward or shouldn't go forward. Or you went to the editorial board because the New York Times editorial could make you or break you in an advocacy campaign. Well, you jump to today, media is so different. I mean, we've now had several mayors who ran basically happily against New York Times editorials. I mean, so the media context has changed. The people running government are very different. Since I think, and this is obviously this is my take on history. I think ever since Giuliani, there's been an emphasis of putting managers to run agencies and not content people or people out of that field to run an agency. So I think when those are the people running agencies, then it's a little harder for advocacy groups to try and talk to them relationally, or they're from the same profession. So I think a lot of the techniques that worked in the past, we have to question how do we adapt them to the changed media, the changed way people communicate. I think there's a lot of potentially positive things resulting out of that, from enhancing organizing ability. But I think we need to kind of step back, not for a long time, but for a moment, to really reflect on what does the next generation of advocacy need to look like.
You want to hazard any thoughts on that?
I don't have the answer, but I mean, clearly social media is key, and some groups have begun to use that very effectively. There's an interesting conversation going on that I kind of say is at the academic level, but there's some people kind of academically in preservation who are kind of wondering, boy, shouldn't we move away from the battle metaphor? Everything's a battle, we're fighting the bad guys. And kind of saying, hasn't preservation outgrown that? And on one level, you kind of think, well, there's something to that. On the other hand, if you're in the village or you're anywhere else that is fighting in battles to save buildings, the battle metaphor seems to be very true. What's the narrative? It was interesting, I don't know if anyone noticed, there was a letter to the editor in the New York Times in the last couple of days signed by the president of the National Trust and I think the head of the Urban League, and it was riffing off the New York Times editorial on the 50th anniversary of the Landmarks Law, which I hope you all read, which is a very supportive editorial and very strongly suggesting that the law hadn't been fully used and should be fully used. So it was a great editorial, but the letter was trying to say, and the Times had talked about the developers and preservationists kind of battling, and this letter was trying to say, we work together, we're happy working together, preservation and developers, and I thought, well, yeah, I understand the spin, and indeed, preservation has become, Roberta Gratz is so articulate on this, her line, which I think is right on, is that the developers are making millions over the buildings we forced them to save. In a sense, preservation has been a boon to the real estate industry. Revenue would not agree with that analysis, but I think many of us feel that, in essence, when a new building is immediately advertised as an instant landmark, or when somebody's trying to build a tower right at the edge of a historic district so they can get the benefit of that value that's been preserved by preservation, I mean, it's clear that, development has benefited so much from preservation. And indeed, there are so many positive partnerships between the two, but what's the dominant feeling? And I think if you're at the front of the battle lines, you feel you're very much in a war posture. And of course, the village has been in a war posture for decades. And in a sense, the gift that keeps giving to the village from an advocacy perspective is NYU. I mean, in a sense, you have the villain. I mean, and one of the gifts of Robert Moses was he put a face on the kind of insensitive type of extreme planning that many people felt was out of control, but it gave you the poster child. So that can help from an organizing perspective.
Right. I agree. I often feel that it would be nice if we didn't have to talk about things as battles and fights and wars, but we don't seem to have a good replacement for that metaphor. Today, certainly, we have an opponent. REBNY, as Tony mentioned, stands for the Real Estate Board of New York, representing all the big developers, everybody. Apparently, real estate brokers are required to become members, and so they've got a big constituency, and they quite consistently, since 1965, have been fighting landmarks. Is there a way forward with REBNY, or with this battle, this war? And you know, relatedly, I mean, if they did suddenly say, "Oh, we love landmarks," would we have no battle to fight? And would we want to have landmarking be uncontroversial?
Well, we could spend a lot more time in our gardens or reading good books if we weren't having to save all the old buildings. I think REBNY, I mean, it'll be interesting. Some of this could be generational. Steve Manola, the head of REBNY, is retiring after, I think he came when the ARC. I think he came off the ARC so I mean, he's been here forever. So that's a generational attitude he has. Some of us on the preservation side have been here forever. You know, we have a history of, there's a history of distrust and battling between those two communities. It could become a generational thing. It may ease off as, I mean, I'm probably one of the few people that still remembers, you know, the gutting of the Biltmore Hotel and kind of that type of, you know, weekend destruction of a building that people were in the midst of, you know, trying to figure out what could be done. So the whole notion of the distrust, you know, and kind of the real estate worldview is those are those, you know, ambushing preservationists who want to designate my building at the 11th hour after I put my deal together. And then we've got a generation of preservationists like myself who are the ones who said, yeah, the Friday night massacre in August, when they come in with a wrecking ball, when you can't get a restraining order because the judges are all out on the island and you have to find one, which was the case with the Biltmore. So some of it, who knows, maybe generational. I'd like to think that REBNY also had more higher return issues in their agenda than beating up on preservation. So I mean, I think that also, maybe those priorities will shift a little. I mean, the landmarks, as those of you who've been reading, I'm sure, the papers, so, you know, less than 4% of New York is in any way under the jurisdiction, if you will, of the Landmarks Commission. So you'd think that would be like a really little thorn in the side of this huge real estate group. And maybe with new leadership, they'll kind of come to realize it is just a small little thing and not, you know, worthy of this level of combat.
Yeah, so then we'll all get to spend more time on our gardens and what have you. But apart from REBNY, there are a lot of interesting currents these days. One thing is, I guess I've heard, I feel, and I've heard other people feel that it seems that there is a lot of interest in what we call preservation among everybody, younger people, older people, but that people in their 20s and 30s are interested in preservation. They might have, they might not be attracted to the words we use. The word preservation maybe sounds uptight or what have you from another generation. And there's an idea that maybe some rebranding could be helpful, but that there is a native interest in preserving. You know, one statistic I've heard, in fact, I think it was at the event last week, there was a big event, one of the many going on to honor Landmarks50, that somebody quoted that, you know, tech companies, you know, they're in older buildings and they're in landmark buildings. So, you know, young happening companies, they want to be in old buildings. There's a desire to, you know, to have that sort of authenticity or history around them. So what do you think about tapping into the next generations and this native interest that does seem to be there?
Well, speaking about my fellow young people
Yes.
that we're trying to energize, right? I'm probably the last one to try and successfully, you know, figure a strategy to get
Maybe some Buddy Holly tunes?
Well, we tried Murder, She Wrote a few weeks ago, so we'll try anything to engage people. But I think you're right. I think there is I think there's a shared set of values that those generations have. I think the question is finding a way to the bridge from generally appreciating that, valuing it, and then understanding that you can't take it for granted, that you have a responsibility to help secure its future, and then helping connect them to ways to be able to do that. And I mean, there are all sorts of generational studies of how do millennials like to interact and the other generations. You know, people don't seem to be joiners anymore. And so I think, you know, in a sense, you have to find other ways to engage people, so much as, you know, family focused. So I think, you know, groups like GVSHP and other advocacy groups have to begin to be very creative in reaching that audience, getting them excited, and then helping them understand how they can play a meaningful role and why they should, that fits in the way they live their lives.
Right, right. I've heard it said that, you know, a connection could be made with the environmental movement. I mean, that in a few ways, one, preserving older buildings is apparently a green thing to do. Another, the idea of, you know, of conservation and preservation are kind of the same thing, pretty closely related. And certainly younger folks are greener than anyone has ever been or want to be. So maybe that's one way. Another way, I wonder, there's a lot of energy now around saving small businesses, certainly in New York and elsewhere. And that's different than landmarking, but there's a connection, isn't there? Or could there be?
Well, there is. I mean, there's also kind of a difference in terms of the language you want to use. So I think preservationists have been very careful over the years not to introduce into the legal conversation about preservation issues that don't fit within the criteria of the law for designation. So I think preservationists have been very sensitive about not wanting to be seen as using the landmarks law to achieve other goals, which indeed is criticized for doing. So I think that there's kind of the narrow, this is what the law does, and that's one conversation. But clearly, if you're concerned about preserving a neighborhood, there has to be a wider range of tools available to do that. Because in a sense, the law was written not to deal with use. And use is so key in preserving the larger context of a neighborhood. So there are other tools that have to be used, and I think preservationists have to link arms with the organizations focused on those other areas and work with them to get the new tools to supplement and augment the wonderful tool we have, which is the landmarks law. But you know, it was designed for a specific set of purposes, and you know, we need to augment it, not stretch it beyond what it can really accommodate.
So you could envision some new laws or mechanisms being, you know, official mechanisms being created.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we haven't in any way pushed the envelope on other tools or mechanisms. And back to something you said a little earlier, you know, when we got the landmarks law, that really focused the whole conversation around preservation on the playing field of the law itself. And so as a result, the advocacy and the expertise we developed was around the designation process, the regulation process. Other cities that didn't have a strong regulatory system to rely on had to be creative in inventing other tools to try and save buildings. Created nonprofits that could directly intervene in the real estate market and buy property and rehab it and sell it. So in a sense, there's a range of tools that actually some other cities have played the leadership role in that we never have pursued as aggressively or have been seen at the cutting edge of. So I think also preservationists need to look at other preservation tools that other cities have developed in addition to tools dealing with issues of use and the like.
Well, that's great. I agree, and it harkens back again to knowing our past. I have a quote from your book. In 1951, the then president of the Municipal Art Society, Edgar Williams, hired architect William Hamilton Russell to take under consideration a study of what is being done in various cities with respect to preserving buildings and sites of historic or aesthetic importance. So it sounds like we could do that today profitably.
Absolutely. I mean, New York tends to have narrow blinders, but on occasion it's been smart enough to look elsewhere. And so actually the early efforts back to that 1913 study, they looked at what, you know, London and Paris were doing to try and control signage. So there's always been a willingness to look elsewhere and take from it what would work in New York.
Right, right. Now, you have some pretty clear and strong feelings about the sort of the almost the social landscape of the preservation movement in New York today. You know, which organization is doing what, the perception of a decreased role of the Municipal Art Society in particular, which was the leader decades ago, and that the way that groups do or don't work together is obviously important to our future. You want to talk about that and any?
Sure. I mean, I think there are a couple of takeaways. One is I think the preservation community in the last 10, 15 years has given itself a luxury it can't afford. And that luxury has been not to like other preservationists and not to work with other preservationists. And what I mean is if we're battling Donald Trump and Donald Trump doesn't do what you want him to do, we're not surprised. When you're in a preservation battle and you reach out to a fellow preservation organization and ask them to be part of it, and they say no, for whatever reason, that is a huge barrier. And so over time, and this is again my perspective, over the last 10, 20 years, preservation groups have become disappointed with each other at times. And so there's not a cohesive preservation community. Now part of it is because of also, there are a lot more preservation groups in 2015 than there were in 1980. When I started to be involved in preservation in the late 70s and early 80s, it was pretty clear that the Municipal Art Society, working with the Landmarks Conservancy and probably in cahoots with the Landmarks Chair, were kind of in charge of what was going on. And the ground troops were kind of happy to take their orders because somebody else was kind of thinking about this strategically. That has totally changed. So now, the good news is we have a number of very robust preservation groups, GVSHP, Landmark West, Friends of the Upper East Side. So we've got a lot more groups, but there's not really a real sense of leadership. And so back, as I say, in the day when kind of MAS would provide that leadership and kind of have the moral authority within preservation to do it, there's kind of, that doesn't exist at the moment, certainly the way it used to. And I think we're suffering from a real lack of leadership within the preservation community.
So we need some leaders, and we need intellectual capital is something that you've talked about, the idea of a think tank, maybe to get these ideas from other places, to create a shared data pool so that we're not all...
We're data deficient. I mean, we're living in the world of big data and data mining, and all sorts of areas are being kind of revolutionized as people understand how to use data to help direct policy and better understand what's going on the ground. And we just don't have a good command of what preservation has accomplished in the last umpteen years. We don't even have a good handle on what are the real statistics around the historic districts, demographics in them, the economics associated with them. So I think we're really suffering from almost the lack of a think tank. But I think the other thing we're suffering from as a movement is we really need kind of an immediate response media team. Kind of like in a presidential election, where the opponent has a truth squad, following the other people around and immediately saying, that's a lie, and confronting them. In a sense, we haven't had a unified, again, a nimble, effective voice that when the real estate board starts to put forward the notion that somehow preservation is in the way of affordable housing, in a sense, they're operating on the big lie theory. If they just say that over and over again, it will be picked up. And indeed it has been. I mean, city council members repeat it verbatim, newspapers repeat it verbatim, as though it was the truth. And what's the source of it? A report issued by the Real Estate Board of New York. So in a sense, they're creating their own facts to support the argument that really doesn't do it. But in a sense, the preservation community's ability to respond in a nimble, effective, strategic way, we just haven't. I think we're still playing catch-up ball, which isn't to say that we don't have wonderful groups working full-time, doing their best, but at the moment, that's not good enough.
Well, you heard it here. Somebody needs to create this. Maybe Anthony Wood, having created NIPAP, or someone else, but we have an opening. Now, I was hopeful that our long celebration of the 50th anniversary of Landmarks 50, and encourage you all to go to the website, which is probably landmarks50.org, something like that. There are ongoing events. This is one of them, one of many. I was hoping that maybe this coming together would achieve some of this, create the cohesiveness, perhaps patch up relationships, move forward the discussion about goals and working together. And you've been involved in an awful lot of it. Any of that happening?
I would say an awful lot of good things have come out of this. It can't be bad for the administration and the new chair and city officials to have gone to 4 different events in the last 3 or 4 weeks, each one populated by literally hundreds of preservationists. So the optics of them understanding there is a real robust constituency with a different set of views than the Real Estate Board of New York is a plus. The anniversary being the excuse for a wonderful New York Times editorial is terrific. There's a huge general public education. I mean, when the Empire State Building is lit up for the 50th, when banners are flying across the city for the 50th, when that logo appears in the subway on their series of ads, that is all good, and it's creating some positive energy. That is not a replacement for a well-organized advocacy effort in response to the policy issues. So it helps create a wonderfully supportive climate. I think it's put some wind out there. We just have to figure out whose sails is that wind going to help advance. And it's certainly engaged, I think there are over 170 groups involved in the 50 Alliance, which itself is terrific. And many of them are groups that don't have preservation anywhere close to their name, which is great because they've seen the larger value that this is something important to them, whether they're the French consulate or a wide variety of groups, graphic designers. I mean, it's just been terrific. The number of people who say, wow, I want to be part of this, it's part of New York, we love our landmarks. So that is all highly valuable, and reminding the world that there is a real preservation community and this law is important. At the same time, earlier this week, a piece of legislation was introduced that many people feel is going to weaken the law. So,
Which one is that? Remind us.
I won't have the exact number for it. I don't know if
been
Andrew's in the audience with it, but it was a bill introduced earlier this week trying to put firm time constraints on the commission in terms of it had to do a certain type of business within a certain time frame. And bills like that don't come with adequate funding and a few other things to make that doable are highly problematic. But so I guess what I'm saying is that it's been a wonderful celebration. It's not over. It's reaching thousands of people. The exhibit at the Museum of the City of New York is phenomenal. Definitely take a look at it. There's a new book that's been issued in association with that that's reaching audiences. So I think all of that is terrific in terms of helping build a larger public constituency. But it's going to take the preservation advocates to make that, turn that into political will. That's the thing that we are missing at the moment, is pressure to create political will. And that's what comes down to everybody in this room to do. Everybody needs to make sure that city council member knows it's unacceptable for them to support any piece of legislation that's going to weaken the landmarks law. And that has to happen neighborhood after neighborhood in the city.
And as you say, the city government itself, the nature of it has changed so much that our advocacy matters all the more. And you've talked about, I think in the 80s at times thinking that, you were in the toughest battle of your life and it seemed like a breeze now, right?
Oh, I gotta tell you, I worked for the Landmarks Commission for 1 year in the early 80s when Kent Barwick was chair. And I remember kvetching all the time about this wimpy agency, we're not doing anything, come on, let's use this law. And now, I think many people who would look at the past 50 years would say that was the Camelot moment for historic preservation, which is kind of sad in one sense. But I think another reason history is important is if you came to New York only in the last 15 years, you would not know how robustly the landmarks law could be used. So if you don't know how it was used in the 80s, if you don't know the creativity it was used to protect the street pattern of Lower Manhattan, there were some very interesting, creative, and appropriate uses of the law that, in a sense, and also just going to a Landmarks Commission hearing that then went till 1 and 2 in the morning to listen to a fully articulate, robust debate on an issue that had not been predetermined in advance. Was a very different way the Landmarks Commission did business than it does today.
We went when we're not even sure if the chair and commissioners are preservationists.
Well, one of the things that struck me as I've been looking back at the history, probably from the passage of the law until the beginning of the Giuliani administration, what the preservation advocates were needing to do was prod the Landmarks Commission to be more courageous, to be more of a, to use the law more aggressively. And the commission was populated by people who believed in it. So you didn't have to convince them that preservation was the right thing to do. You had to convince them that the right thing to do was to use the law in this situation or that situation. So you were basically trying to convince people who believed in preservation to do more. I think almost since the Giuliani period, the advocates have been trying to convince the Landmarks Commission to be a preservationist body. So it's a whole different type of advocacy, and actually a much more challenging advocacy.
If you could snap your fingers and save a building, create a historic district in New York City today, what's at the top of your list?
Oh, where would you begin?
We'll give you a few, so not just one.
Well, I'm kind of a strategic guy, so the most interesting thing about the landmarks law, and its strength and its weakness, is that the law basically says that a landmark, if it meets the number of year criteria, is basically whatever
30, right?
whatever the sitting landmarks commission says it is. And what's an appropriate change to a building operationally becomes what the sitting landmarks commission says it is. So if I could wave a wand, I would repopulate the Landmarks Preservation Commission and handpick its chair. Then I would have everything.
He's not afraid to name names, so you want to pick your
Your
chair?
applications can be sent.
Okay. Okay, so you wave a wand. Yeah, well, that's good. But how about some beloved buildings, new or old, special ones that are special to your heart?
It's funny, I don't think that way. I mean, I just love, to me, the real treat is just spending endless hours walking through historic neighborhoods. I mean, it's just the overall quality of the environment. And that's what I like. When I live on the east side and I go to the west side, it's like, wow, I'm in Paris. I saved an airplane ticket. Kind of in a slightly different neighborhood, the people are a little different, a different accent, but it's great. And I was actually in Brooklyn earlier this week, of all things, and it was like, wow. I was in Borum Hill. I said, wow, I saved another air ticket. Here's a whole wonderful, distinct place. And we have just one after another of those incredible places. If I was going to, if you gave me my wand and I could go backwards, I would save 2 Columbus Circle. If I could really go back, I'd put back the Brokaw mansions. Penn Station, I don't know, if I put Penn Station back, then we might not have as robust a landmarks movement, so I don't know. But assuming that would be, another one you'd want to put back.
It's funny about, you can just go to a new neighborhood and experience a whole new world. They're like microclimates, and I get a kick out of the fashion differences, even just from, going from different dress codes. So going back to Albert Bard, who laid the groundwork for where we are today, are we laying the groundwork for something now? Is there an Albert Bard of today, or could you, looking into the future, what are we building?
I think we're missing at the moment the big ideas. I think we've been in such a defensive posture, trying to madly hold on to what we have, that I don't think people have had the comfort level or courage or ability to imagine how we could improve our lot. So I think the big idea is we need viewshed protection, protecting parts of the skyline. Which I think you could clearly do under the authorizing legislation, under the Bard Act. In a sense, pushing the aesthetic envelope of what you talked earlier about uses, mom and pop stores. So I think there are a lot of things we haven't solved, but in a sense, where's the idea today that may take 30 years to come into reality? It's not, I don't see that many of them out there. It doesn't mean they aren't out there. They may not have been lifted up or brought into the space I'm in. But that's, I think, what we need. So I don't see that much of it. I mean, the landmarks law, I mean, Bard had his image in 1913 of regulating for aesthetics, but it was in 1951 when the Municipal Art Society president actually said there ought to be a law. And so you look, that was 1951, it took till 1965. So I mean, again, we think of things as in such short time periods that it's a problem, because some of these ideas just take time. You have to articulate them, you have to build a constituency for them, you have to find out what the legal vehicle is to implement them, and then you have to create the political will for that vehicle to become part of law or part of the way business is done. That takes time. And that's again the value of the history, to remind us this doesn't happen overnight. We have to lay the groundwork. We have to be out there doing the education.
Well, with that, we're happy to take some questions, if there are any. Anybody?
This is, okay, works.
Tony, are you at liberty tonight in this discussion to drill down a little deeper on this very crucial issue of lack of leadership in the preservation community, the competing organizations? How are we going to speak truly with one voice and so forth and so on?
We can give that a shot, but do you have any thoughts?
I'm going to ask the master.
The master.
I have to tell you, it's a tough one. I mean, I've kind of, you know, over the years tried, imagined different approaches and tried them. It's tough. Some of it will probably require leadership change. I mean, just like a generational thing, some of it may. It's also, things may just have to get, I mean, again, there's, you know, silver linings to dark clouds. I would like to believe that the extremely well-organized multi-year assault on the landmarks law that has been mounted by the Real Estate Board of New York will scare the bejesus out of the existing preservation groups and convince them to put aside whatever unhappiness, whatever baggage that is being carried around, and sit down and forge a coordinated strategy. Everybody doesn't have to believe in every aspect of the operation of a strategy, but I think there has to be a sense of this is where we need to go, and then various groups can figure out the role they can play in making it happen. There needs to be a much more effective public communications dimension to this. One of the examples that I'll bring out, and I think the groups hate it, but it is so evident of the problem, is during the last years of the Bloomberg administration, when he proposed the Midtown rezoning around Grand Central Terminal. The three leading preservation groups came out with 3 separate lists of buildings. They gave the real estate board, they gave the post columnists a gun to put to the preservationist's head, and they looked ridiculous. And we can't afford that type of misstep. On the positive side, I think the groups began to work together effectively in response to the latest chair's desire in the fall to de-landmark, well, basically to remove 190 buildings from having been calendared and kind of hanging in that area. And so the groups, I think, effectively came together there. But I also think part of the success was the kind of stumbling that the administration did around that idea. I mean, I think if they'd actually more brilliantly advanced it, they might have pulled it off. But the good news is I think the preservation community did effectively come together, but there has to be more of that.
Are you willing to convene a summit?
I'll have to tell you, the problem with summits is you know, and I was in the trenches for many years, the danger with a summit is you get all those excited people together in a room, they all let off steam for 2 hours and feel they've done something, and they all go home, and nothing changes. So my idea of a summit would be to get a small number of key players in a room, convened by somebody who had the ability to do it, who had the ability to also kind of make them behave, and lock the door, and restrict food and water until they all came out as happy campers with a shared battle plan.
I want to point out 2 things that I think are relevant to everything you said there, Tony. One is that the change of focus of MAS seems to be something that has not been recovered from, that the Municipal Art Society for a long time was the leader.
The Municipal Art Society was the great preservation rabbit that spawned all sorts of wonderful groups and initiatives and activities, but they've clearly, you know, moved into a different direction.
And so, you know, I think perhaps there's a lack of recovering from that, which
Well,
time.
there's a
already,
vacuum. I mean, in a sense, there's a vacuum, and I think the world has not been realigned around that.
But there's something else important, which is money. I mean, I would guess that Rebney's swimming in it. Lots of dues, lots of, their constituents are for profit, we're not for profit. And that's, we can acknowledge that if we were swimming in money, we would have a think tank already, we would have a plan, we would have a communications SWAT team, and so maybe that matters.
I'm the first to say money matters. And I think that, in one hand, if you were to add the budgets together of the major 6, 8, or 10 preservation
You don't want to know the
groups,
answer?
well, actually, it would be, certainly a larger number than existed 20 or 30 years ago. So we certainly need more money, without a doubt. But then I think strategically, one has to decide where's the best to invest that money. A lot of money is invested, rightly or wrongly, in paid staff trooping down to the Landmarks Commission to testify on every change of fenestration, which is important, I believe. There used to be things volunteers did. But if that money was instead invested in taking on Repney, would that be a better investment? I don't know. But I think strategic decisions have to be made. And I think there has to be money on the table. I think there could be money on the table if there was real leadership that was shown.
Any other questions?
We also have a microphone,
Yes.
so.
Anybody? Anything goes? Okay, we've got this lady, yeah?
If you could wait.
Oh, thank you. So, back to affordable housing. I mean, not only has that Redney report come out with its position, but I read that a whole bunch of affordable housing organizations have formed to support the NYU plan. Now, yes. Anybody else read that?
Why?
What, because they think it's gonna be good for affordable housing? That was my question too, why? So, yes, I agree with you, we need a nimble body to respond to other people's reports, but how are we gonna be proactive? Because we can't just be in the defensive all the time. And whoever came up with these, corralled these advocacy groups, affordable housing groups, and got them to sign on, I'm upset that you don't know about this, because now I'm thinking I'm crazy, but I know I read it.
We apologize.
But anyway, what if we did a big report on the Empire State Building? I mean, it was totally rehabbed to platinum LEED certification. The money in that must have been fantastic. I mean, there must have been a reason to do it, because a financial reason to do it. So all these unions who are behind Rebney because they want their construction projects, can't we find unions who are equally interested in rehabbing projects, like the Empire State Building? I mean, we need unions on our side, we need brokers on our side. Why can't we compel brokers to join the GVSHP?
So how does it work?
I mean, you've laid out, I think that the big takeaway of what you said, I think the big thought is we have to have a proactive agenda. We have to be for something as opposed to just necessarily fighting bad things, but we have to be looking forward. I mean, so, should there be a tax break that encourages the use of historic buildings for affordable housing? I mean, such things exist. We could be putting forward a proactive policy agenda. And frankly, whether it gets passed in 2 years, 8 years, 30 years, having something to advocate for is important. It also shifts the debate. Then the debate will be, well, is this bill that would encourage preservation of old buildings because it would create affordable housing? Is it a good thing, is it a bad thing? But all of a sudden that'll be a very different discussion than, preservation is bad for affordable housing or vice versa. So you're right, we have to do that, and we have to build those constituencies. I think part of the problem is we haven't had the strategic focus. When there have been some big preservation battles, there's been an effort to build broad constituencies around a particular issue, but I think sustaining those or having ongoing meaningful relationships with key unions and the like is just an investment of time and resources, because you just can't call them when you need them. I mean, there has to be an ongoing dialogue. It hasn't been made a priority, and that's one of the things we need to reevaluate.
Sorry, last thing, why don't we partner with Habitat for Humanity and rehab an historic building and tell
It's been
the
done-
entire world
Been
that
done in other places.
for historic, but
Yeah.
specifically for affordable housing.
Yeah.
I mean, and so not do it on a little building in Trenton, but an apartment building.
No, I think, I mean, that makes sense, but I think we also probably should face the reality that the Real Estate Board of New York does not care about affordable housing at all. They are using this as an issue to undermine preservation. I mean, it's also, they don't care about income inequality, they don't care about racial diversity. These are obviously my opinions, they will say other things. But in essence, they are using those issues to attack preservation because they feel that's the way to attack preservation in this administration that cares about those things. But I think that we could, if we went to the Real Estate Board of New York and say, hey, you're wrong, we actually produced 600 units of affordable housing, they will not go away with the issue. So the facts to them are slightly irrelevant, in my opinion, in terms of the big debate that's going on, which doesn't mean we shouldn't do that, but it's not gonna, we're not gonna win them over on those actions. They've got a larger agenda that's playing out.
We're in the reality-based community on this thing. But it strikes me that, Tony, that the, sort of the leadership that we're craving here and the cohesion, the lack thereof, is an outcome of this phenomenon that is also a good thing, which is which you mentioned, of having so many preservation groups, that 1,000 flowers have bloomed. That's wonderful, but the profusion is also a fragmentation.
It doesn't
And
have,
if
it
there
doesn't
weren't the
have to be.
profusion and the fragmentation, then maybe there'd be one charge.
I mean, it's great to have 1,000 flowers blooming if they're all in the same garden, right?
Yeah.
And so in a sense, I think it's really terrific that we have the number of groups we have today. And I don't think the danger is that we have a lot of groups on the ground in different neighborhoods bumping into each other. I think it's more at the level above that. Because those groups are really focusing appropriately on what's happening in their neighborhood, monitoring that closely. And I think they move into the larger issues when they see a problem that isn't being addressed by a citywide group that's impacting them. But I think those groups would love to be, in a sense, to follow the lead of a group that was trying to address the issues on a policy systemic level, or at least would welcome somebody doing that thinking for them.
Well, I'll throw out an idea that I've talked about with some other people here, that I think part of the branding issue, part of the moving to the future question has to do with really connecting the preservation of old things to the future.
Yeah.
And I want to share a little quote with you that was from the writer Robert Caro. He made a comment in a booklet that was published in 2009 when the first section of the High Line opened. And he said, you know, there have been a lot of struggles, many lost. This one was one. He said, this is the story of a unique vision of a way to save a link to New York's past and to save it in a way that would make it a link to New York's future as well. Maybe sometimes when we want to save some old building, we're not making the link to the future and people don't get it.
In my mind, preservation is not an antiquarian, effort. We're not running around saving all these buildings in order to make them little house museums. And we're certainly not striving for what Paul Goldberger once worried about of a Williamsburg on the Hudson. That's, in my opinion, not what's motivating preservation. Preservation is all about...
Williamsburg, Virginia.
Yes, I'm sorry, yeah. Very good point. Now that
As a Virginian, I can make that.
and with the emergence of Brooklyn, I have to be very careful. But I mean, I think that it's all about the future. And the report you mentioned earlier, in a sense, there was a report recently done that basically showed that a huge percentage of all the dot-com stuff in New York is happening in old buildings in historic districts. And in a sense, it's a belief that these buildings have a future life and a contribution to make to the city. I mean, and that's where I take issue with our friends at the Real Estate Board is their predictive abilities have been off point from day one. I mean, when the Landmarks law was passed, they basically said, this is gonna stifle New York. Not so much. When the Ladies Mile Historic District was being debated, they said, that'll be like the kiss of death for that area. Of course, see what Ladies Mile is like today. So in a sense, these buildings are actually full of future potential that we see being actualized time and time again. There was a quote from a representative of Radio City Music Hall when there was a hearing on its future. And they basically said, boy, if you designating Radio City Music Hall will be the nails in his coffin. Don't think so. So in a sense, time and again, what we've seen is the historic resources have been a springboard to the future. And even if New York City, even if, back to the wand you gave me, say we doubled the number of landmarks in New York overnight, so all of a sudden 8% of the city is protected. My math isn't good, but that's still 92% of New York open for wonderful, new, creative, Norman Foster-esque buildings. I mean, so in essence, to me, the whole notion that you could preserve too much of New York, knowing the political dynamics that the city operates, is ludicrous. I mean, it'll never happen. And there is this creative tension going on, and there should be a tension. And we don't have to worry, there always will be. But, the bottom line is, to me, it's all about the future. What is it that we want to consciously take and bring into the future that we want to have for the city of New York?
Thank you. Any other questions? Anything at all?
Yeah, what do you think about the city council giving 18 months to the Landmarks Commission? Do you think that's a good thing to kind of spur them on, or do you think it takes more time than just 18 months?
Well, let's clarify, 18 months to...
To designate a building a landmark?
From perhaps, from some moment in time when it was first proposed or reaches a certain stage. Yeah. In a perfect world, which we don't have, with a Landmarks Commission that was fully funded, which it isn't, you might think something like that made a lot of sense. I think the reality is it becomes a way for the commission with political pressure not to take action on something. So in a sense, right now, I mean, if they were going to do something, there would have to be a public hearing, and they'd be forced to make a decision one way or another. If in essence, if at a certain number of days expire and the building just goes away in terms of being considered, it kind of undercuts the whole notion of a robust public process. When the landmarks law was created, it wasn't created to save every landmark quality building in New York. It was created to make sure no landmark quality building was unnecessarily lost. And the lesson from Penn Station was there wasn't a public process where there was an opportunity to explore whether there was any other way, any other outcome besides demolition for a cherished landmark. So in a sense, it's all about the process. And so when you start manipulating the process in ways that can undermine it, that's a problem. So I think the danger with some of these ideas is on the face of it, it sounds rational and it sounds logical. Of course, we all need deadlines in life, right? Get to it. But this is a highly nuanced area. Years ago, when the landmarks law was first passed, and up until 1973, there was a built-in moratorium in the law that the Landmarks Commission could only hold hearings for a certain period, and then they couldn't take any action. And the Landmarks Commission actually didn't mind that so much because it kind of took the pressure off. And it was the preservation community who helped push for that to be changed in the 1973 amendments. But from a government agency perspective, it's kind of, you can kind of hide behind some of these things, or things will be settled off to the sidelines. So I think you have to really think long and hard. And also, before you change the landmarks law, you need to really understand, is that the only way to solve the problem? Because that's a pretty radical thing to do. I will say the new chair has been, in talking about her accomplishments in the first period she's been here, has really stressed the ability that the commission has been able to hear things and take action with greater speed than in the past. And has cited several examples of that. So I think it's also in the behavior of the commission. If the commission started to take action on the buildings that had been calendared but had been sitting in limbo, the issue would go away. If the commission just started to hold those hearings, work through that backlog, once the backlog's gone, the issue's gone. You don't have to change the law.
There could be a voluntary change of habit rather than a change of law.
You don't have to change the law, you can change how it's operationalized.
How do you avoid a situation where the calendaring is used to stall a project for all practical purposes in perpetuity. You had some items on the calendar which had been there for 40 years and not dealt with.
No, I think in fairness, those have to be brought forward and
How?
dealt with.
But how?
Well, it's how all the commission has to do is decide to put it on a calendar and take action. And some of them, the other thing is you have to, I think, look at the list, because there is probably a narrative behind many of them. I haven't studied the list, I haven't looked at it recently enough, but people have told me, like, for instance, there are a number of churches on that list. Well, the reason they're on that list is that the religious community, by and large, battles preservation. So, they've kind of left that in limbo, I guess, because they didn't want to walk into a battle that they felt they would lose. So, there's a story behind each one.
We have time for one more question. If there's a curious person in the audience.
There's Ann.
Tony, I was wondering if you could, oh, sorry.
Yeah, Tony, I was wondering if you could just address briefly, sort of going back to the sort of the early history. If you could just address briefly the context in which BARD operated, in that there was a whole constellation of civic groups at that time. Some of them which still exist, like the Citizens Union and Municipal Art Society. And I wonder if you could talk a little about who were the people on those groups and what was their sort of position in the city and so on and so forth, and how did that contribute to preservation?
There certainly was a robust number of civic organizations, and I want to do a little larger sweep of time, because I think that's also one of the interesting challenges today, is I think the number of civic organizations today that are kind of at the citywide level are a lot less than there were in the early, even 1980s. And so there's been a change in the landscape. And I think also when you look at leadership in terms of, the preservation movement has been a volunteer movement, right, from the beginning of time. So the type of civic gentry that got so upset with Moses in the 50s were, many of them were lawyers. I mean, many of them were in professions where it was kind of an accepted part of how you lived your life, that you would be involved civically. And let me also throw in another mess, and then I'll pull this together. If you also look at the early leadership of many of these campaigns, they were led by women. And one of the reasons they were led by women were very talented, sophisticated, smart women were locked out of so many opportunities to be involved, that preservation, the garden clubs, were areas where they actually could show leadership and play a leading role. Fast forward to today, there have been dramatic changes. So in a sense, some of the full-time volunteer leaders who were so active in the village, and you just think of so many of these great people. When you look at society today, those civic gentry guys, who are working for a law firm or an investment firm, aren't putting as much time, and society's changed. They're not devoting huge amounts of time as much, I think, to some of these groups. Women have so many professional opportunities. So looking forward in terms of where's the leadership going to come from, I think there's some very interesting changes in society that have an impact on advocacy and preservation advocacy. But the decrease, so when BARD was active, BARD was kind of a good guy version of what Moses did. Moses ended up holding, don't quote me on the number, but 14 or 15 government positions simultaneously, and as a result, he could have a number of agencies work very effectively together because he was running them all together. Well, BARD was kind of a non-profit version of that, in that he was on, a half a dozen different boards. And so, when he's on half a dozen different boards and on their legal committees, then when an idea like the BARD Act comes to, Albany, who's writing all the support letters and memos of support from all those various groups? Well, it's BARD. And he's helping those groups understand it. He's advocating it within those groups. So there was a climate, there was a kind of an ecosystem, a civic ecosystem. So I think the big unanswered question is today's civic ecosystem and the future civic ecosystem. What's that going to look like, and how do we work within that to continue the robust advocacy preservation needs? Because a big takeaway on the history is historic preservation is a key example of when the people lead, the politicians will follow. or the government will follow. So people, it's the people of New York who basically pushed for this law, have kind of overseen the law from an advocacy perspective, have defended the law, have aggressively pushed the city to defend its own law at key times. So in a sense, that is a positive thread over time. And so the future of the law is literally in the hands of everybody in this room. You know, in a sense, it's not in the hands of one mayor, it's not in the hands of one landmarks chair, it's really in the hands of whether there will be a constituency of New Yorkers who demand that we continue to have a robust landmarks law.
So folks, that's you. Thank you for coming tonight.